The kitchen felt like an absolute furnace. Emily wiped a heavy bead of sweat from her forehead, using the back of her flour-covered hand. She stood right at the centre of the massive oak island. The island was completely covered in mixing bowls, heavy plates and half-chopped vegetables. It was exactly 3:00 in the afternoon on a very hot Sunday. The house was entirely silent except for the loud bubbling of a heavy steel pot on the stove. Emily let out a long, shaky breath. She was 42 years old, but today she felt absolutely ancient. Her tired feet throbbed inside her comfortable shoes. She had been standing on the hard tile floor for almost 4 uninterrupted hours. This was the mandatory weekly tradition. It was a tradition she never once asked for, but had somehow fully inherited. Every single Sunday, ever since her mother passed away 3 years ago, Emily prepared the massive family dinner. She did not just bring a simple side dish. She planned the entire complex menu, bought all the expensive groceries with her own money, and cooked every single item completely from scratch. Her father, Robert, strictly insisted on it. He confidently claimed it was the only proper way to honour her late mother. He always said it kept the family together. But as Emily chopped another massive mountain of thick carrots, she felt incredibly deeply alone. She looked out the large kitchen window. The suburban lawn was perfectly manicured, green and lush. Robert was out there, sitting comfortably in a padded patio chair. He was reading a thick Sunday newspaper, leisurely sipping a tall glass of cold iced tea. He did not look up even once. He did not come inside to ask if she needed a quick glass of water. He simply expected the food to be hot, perfectly seasoned, and ready on the dining table by exactly 5:00. Emily felt a familiar heavy knot tighten deeply in her stomach. It was a tight knot made of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. She reached for a heavy wooden spoon, stirring the thick stew bubbling loudly on the front burner. The hot steam rose up rapidly, burning her tired eyes. She blinked away a sudden sharp rush of hot tears. She told herself she could not cry right now. Crying would completely ruin the delicate timing of the heavy roast sitting in the oven. That was exactly how her exhausted brain worked now. Her own personal emotions were always entirely secondary to the family schedule. The heavy back door creaked open slowly. Emily did not even bother to turn around. She already knew the heavy, slow footsteps of her father. "Something smells like it is burning," Robert announced loudly, his deep voice echoing sharply across the warm kitchen. Emily closed her eyes just for a brief, agonizing second. "Nothing is burning," she said softly, keeping her voice completely level and calm. "It is just the brown sugar glaze for the carrots." Robert walked over slowly, peering critically over her tense shoulder. He did not offer a polite, warm greeting. He certainly did not say thank you for her incredibly hard work. "Your mother always used significantly less sugar," he noted casually, shaking his grey head with a small, heavy sigh of profound disappointment. "She never ever let the glaze get quite that dark." Emily gripped the hard edge of the cold granite counter. Her tense knuckles turned completely bone white. She forcefully swallowed the massive lump of bitter frustration rising rapidly in her throat. "I will turn the heat down right now," she whispered quietly, reaching quickly for the stove dial. Robert gave a short, highly satisfied nod. "Make sure you pull out and use the good china plates tonight," he ordered firmly, already turning away to leave. "Jessica is bringing her new husband over, and I want the dining table to look perfectly, absolutely presentable." Emily stood completely frozen in place. Her tight chest felt incredibly heavy. She watched her father walk slowly out of the warm kitchen, disappearing back into the cool, air-conditioned comfort of the living room. He easily left her alone with the oppressive heat, the massive mess, and the completely overwhelming expectations. She looked directly at the massive steel sink. It was already overflowing with dirty, heavy, greasy pans. She knew deep down in her bones there was absolutely no one coming to help her wash them tonight. There was no one coming to gently tell her to sit down, relax, and take a well-deserved rest. She was the totally invisible engine of this entire family. She kept the heavy wheels turning completely unnoticed until something finally went wrong. A single hot tear escaped rolling fast down her flushed cheek. She wiped it away, fiercely angry at her own vulnerability. She picked up the heavy wooden spoon again, and she just kept stirring. The Sunday dinner had to be perfect. It always inevitably had to be perfect. The front door swung open with a loud, sudden crash against the wall. Emily jumped slightly, nearly dropping the heavy ceramic serving dish. Jessica marched into the dining room, holding a tiny, expensive designer handbag. Her husband Thomas trailed closely behind her, looking completely detached and deeply bored. They were exactly 45 minutes late. Emily had been keeping the heavy roast warm in the oven, praying quietly that it would not completely dry out. "I am so incredibly starved," Jessica announced brightly, completely ignoring the massive amount of chaotic effort it took to keep the dinner perfectly hot. She dropped her heavy winter coat directly onto a clean dining chair. The traffic on the highway was an absolute total nightmare. Emily carried the hot, heavy dish to the large table, her arms shaking slightly from the prolonged physical strain. "Hello, Jessica," she said softly, wiping her damp hands on her stained cooking apron. "I am just very glad you both made it safely." Jessica leaned over the beautifully set table, sniffing the air with a highly critical, sharp expression. "Is that the brown sugar glaze on the carrots?" she asked, her voice dropping into a small familiar whine. "You know I am trying to eat completely clean this entire month, Emily. I specifically texted you about my new strict diet on Tuesday afternoon." Emily closed her tired eyes for a fraction of a second. "I made a large, completely plain green salad just for you," she replied calmly, pointing a shaking finger toward the large crystal bowl sitting near the table centre. Thomas sat down heavily at the table loudly, clinking his silver fork against the fine china plate. "Let us just eat the food," he muttered, completely dismissing the obvious heavy emotional tension radiating from his wife. Robert walked slowly into the dining room, taking his usual dominant seat at the absolute head of the long table. He did not reprimand Jessica for being terribly late. He simply smiled warmly at his youngest daughter, passing her the large platter of roasted vegetables. As they began to casually pass the heavy, steaming dishes, the loud, clattering noise of the silver utensils filled the quiet room. Emily finally sat down in her own wooden chair, her entire body aching with a deep, throbbing fatigue. She picked up her fork, but her appetite was entirely gone. So Emily Robert began loudly clearing his throat. He set his heavy water glass down onto the crisp linen tablecloth. "I want to talk to you about the old lakeside cabin." Emily felt a cold, sharp pit drop instantly into her stomach. She looked up from her untouched plate, feeling suddenly very small and highly defensive. "What about the cabin, Dad?" she asked carefully. Robert leaned forward, resting his thick forearms heavily on the table. "Jessica and Thomas found a wonderful, massive new house in the upper suburbs," he explained proudly, gesturing toward the younger sitting couple. "It is completely perfect for them, but it needs a significant amount of immediate renovation work. The kitchen is terribly outdated and far too small." Jessica nodded eagerly, her eyes shining with absolute greedy anticipation. "We really need a massive open floor plan, Dad. It is entirely crucial for entertaining our important guests. I think it is definitely time we sell your mother's old cabin," Robert stated bluntly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for any gentle argument. "The local real estate market is incredibly strong right now. We can easily take the cash, and we can directly fund your sister's new home renovations." It is exactly what your late mother would have wanted us to do. Emily stared blankly at her father, completely stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his sudden demand. The small, quiet lakeside cabin was the absolute only thing her mother had left entirely, exclusively to her. It was her only remaining safe sanctuary. "But it belongs to me," Emily said, her voice shaking with a sudden raw emotional pain. "Mom specifically left the legal deed in my name, Dad." Jessica rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, highly dramatic sigh of pure, bitter annoyance. "Do not be so incredibly selfish, Emily," she snapped loudly, stabbing a piece of dry lettuce with her silver fork. "You never even go up there anyway. You are always far too busy managing the kids and staying at home. Why should an empty, rotting wooden cabin just sit there while Thomas and I actually need the financial help to start our real successful life?" Robert frowned deeply, looking directly at Emily, with intense, heavy, crushing disappointment. "Family always helps family, Emily," he commanded sternly. "I already called the real estate broker yesterday morning. I need you to sign the legal transfer paperwork by Wednesday afternoon. Do not make this into a difficult, overly emotional, unnecessary drama." Emily looked around the beautifully set dining table. She looked at the massive, elaborate meal she had just spent painful hours preparing completely from scratch, just to please them. They were happily eating the warm food she cooked, sitting comfortably in the chairs she meticulously cleaned, and they were completely, casually demanding the very last piece of her own identity. She felt entirely, utterly invisible. She felt like nothing more than a convenient, silent resource to be endlessly consumed. "I need to clear the plates," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the loud clinking of their silverware. She did not wait for an answer. She stood up, gathered the empty serving dishes, and walked quickly back into the sweltering kitchen. The heavy swinging door closed behind her, finally cutting off the sound of Jessica complaining about the lack of closet space in her new house. Emily set the heavy dishes down on the counter, her hands shaking violently. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the cold granite, and finally let the tears fall. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, absolutely terrified that they would hear her breaking down. She desperately needed a tissue. She opened the small top drawer of the wooden cabinet, pushing aside a messy clutter of old matchbooks and spare keys. Her hand brushed against her mother's vintage wooden recipe box. It was a beautiful dark mahogany box, a cherished heirloom she had carefully rescued from the house the week her mother passed. Emily paused, sniffing quietly, and pulled the heavy box out. She opened the small brass latch, staring down at the hundreds of faded handwritten index cards. She just wanted to see her mother's familiar, elegant handwriting, to find a brief moment of comfort. She thumbed slowly through the tabbed sections, passing the heavy stews, the sweetbreads, and the holiday pies. Near the very back, wedged tightly behind the dessert section, her fingers caught on something completely different. It was not a stiff index card. It was a thin, folded yellow envelope. Emily pulled it out, her heart suddenly pounding heavily in her chest. The front of the envelope simply read, "For Emily when she is ready." It was definitely her mother's precise handwriting. Her hands trembled as she carefully opened the brittle paper seal. She pulled out a single-lined sheet of paper. "My dearest Emily," the letter began. "If you are reading this, I am already gone, and you are likely standing in that terribly hot kitchen, making your father his perfect Sunday roast. You always were the good, completely reliable daughter. I am writing this to you strictly in secret because I have a very heavy, deep regret. For 35 years I carried the entire emotional weight of this family. I organized every holiday, I quietly absorbed your father's dark moods, and I endlessly catered to your sister's extremely demanding whims. I made their lives perfectly smooth, but in doing so I completely erased myself. I see you doing the exact same thing, Emily. I see you quietly swallowing your own needs, constantly shrinking yourself to make them completely comfortable. Emily let out a sharp, ragged breath. Hot tears blurred her tired vision, falling freely onto the old paper. "You must stop the letter," continued the blue ink, pressing deeply into the page. "You cannot set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. They will never, ever learn to build their own fire as long as you are constantly burning. That is exactly why I left the lakeside cabin exclusively entirely to you. Your father will undoubtedly try to sell it. Jessica will eagerly try to claim it. Do not let them take it. It is your sanctuary, your safe place to breathe. Let them figure out their own messes. Find your own voice, my beautiful girl. Stop carrying their heavy bags." Emily read the letter 3 consecutive times. The powerful words washed over her, striking a deep, vibrating chord in her very soul. She carefully folded the letter, holding it tightly against her chest. She closed her eyes, and a profound, massive tectonic shift happened deep inside her mind. The heavy, crushing guilt that had rigidly controlled her entire adult life simply evaporated. The chronic fear of disappointing them completely vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp, and very quiet clarity. She was absolutely done. She wiped her wet face with a cold, damp dishcloth. She smoothed down her messy hair. She took off her stained cooking apron, folding it neatly, and set it down heavily on the island. She walked back into the formal dining room. They were still eagerly eating, completely oblivious to her prolonged absence. "Did you bring out the cherry pie yet?" Robert asked, not even bothering to look up from his plate. "No," Emily said, her voice completely calm, entirely devoid of its usual anxious flutter. "I did not bake a pie today. I am going home now." Jessica dropped her silver fork, looking completely, utterly scandalized. "You are leaving right now," she demanded, her voice rising in sharp, offended disbelief. "Who is going to clean up this massive, filthy kitchen?" Emily picked up her purse from the small hall table. "You are Jessica," she replied smoothly, not a single trace of anger or hesitation in her tone. "Have a wonderful evening." She walked directly out the front door, stepping into the cool, dark night, leaving them sitting in absolute stunned silence. The bright morning sun streamed heavily through the kitchen window, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet room. Emily sat alone at her small kitchen table, holding a hot ceramic mug of dark coffee. It was exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Normally, this exact hour was a chaotic high-speed race against the ticking clock. She would usually be frantically texting her father, reminding him to pick up his heavy winter suits from the local downtown cleaner. She would usually be drafting a massive, highly detailed grocery list for her sister. But today, Emily simply sat still, watching the thick steam rise slowly from her warm cup. She took a long, slow sip, letting the bitter, rich taste ground her completely in the present moment. Her cell phone rested silently on the smooth wooden table, its screen dark and completely lifeless. A sharp, familiar ping echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. The screen of her phone lit up brightly, displaying an automated calendar reminder. It boldly read, "Call Dad about the dry cleaning." Emily felt a sudden familiar tightening in her chest. Her long, ingrained habit screamed at her to pick up the phone to dial his number and to manage his entirely adult responsibilities. Her fingers twitched slightly, reaching instinctively for the smooth glass of the phone. She closed her eyes, taking a very deep, shaking breath. She pictured the thin, folded yellow envelope sitting safely upstairs in her private wooden drawer. She pictured her late mother exhausted and completely invisible, endlessly running errands for a man who never once said thank you. Emily slowly pulled her hand back, resting it firmly on her own lap. She opened her eyes, reached out with a single finger, and permanently deleted the bright calendar notification. The screen went dark again, returning the room to absolute peaceful silence. Exactly 2 hours later, the phone vibrated violently against the heavy table. The caller identification flashed with Jessica's name. Emily let it ring 3 consecutive times, forcing herself to breathe deeply before finally sliding her finger across the screen to answer. "Hello, Jessica," Emily said, keeping her voice incredibly soft and completely neutral. "Emily, I am in a state of absolute total panic." Jessica practically screamed through the small speaker, her voice high and breathless. "The big charity bake sale for the neighborhood association is this coming Friday morning. I completely forgot to email the volunteer sheet to the other mothers, and I absolutely need you to bake your famous double chocolate brownies. I need at least 6 dozen wrapped perfectly in individual clear bags with those cute little pink ribbons you always use." Emily listened carefully to her sister, hearing the absolute blind entitlement in every single spoken word. Jessica did not ask if Emily had the free time. She did not politely request a simple favour. She simply demanded the heavy, time-consuming labour, entirely expecting Emily to drop her own life to save her from her own severe lack of planning. Emily looked down at her own quiet, clean kitchen counter. "I cannot do that, Jessica," Emily replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady, completely devoid of the usual frantic apologies. "What do you mean you cannot do it?" Jessica demanded loudly, scoffing into the phone. "You always bake the brownies, Emily. It is literally the only thing people actually buy at my entire booth. You know, I cannot bake from scratch, and I absolutely have to impress the neighborhood board president this year. Just run to the grocery store today and get the chocolate. It is not that hard." Emily felt a small, quiet spark of power ignite deep inside her chest. It was not a burning, angry fire. It was a cool, brilliant, and completely unshakable light. "I am not baking the brownies this year," Jessica Emily stated clearly, deliberately pausing to let the words sink in. "I also am not managing your volunteer email list. You will need to figure out your own booth for the charity event." There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the other end of the line. Emily could practically hear the gears grinding in her sister's head, entirely unable to process the word no. "You are being completely incredibly petty about the cabin," Jessica finally snapped her tone, turning instantly vicious and deeply cruel. "You are ruining my important charity event just to punish me and Dad. You are so incredibly bitter, Emily." Emily did not defend herself. She did not argue back, nor did she desperately try to explain the deep, agonizing exhaustion she had carried for 35 years. She knew that any explanation would just be twisted into another heavy weapon against her. "I hope you figure out a good solution for the bake sale," Jessica Emily said gently, absolutely refusing to engage in the toxic fight. "Have a very good afternoon." She moved her finger firmly, ending the active call. She set the phone down, her heart beating a fast, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had actually done it. She had explicitly refused to carry the heavy emotional bag. The sky did not fall down. The world did not suddenly end. For the first time in her entire adult life, Emily felt a massive, invisible weight lift completely off her tired shoulders. She walked over to the kitchen sink, running the warm water over her coffee mug, feeling completely, utterly free. After washing the mug, Emily walked slowly into her living room. Her own house was quiet, peaceful, and beautifully clean. She looked around at the framed photographs of her own children and the cosy, soft furniture she had picked out with her husband, Michael. This was her real, actual life. For so many years, this beautiful life had been completely secondary to the endless, highly demanding crises of her father and her sister. She walked over to the large bookshelf, pulling down a thick, heavy novel she had purchased exactly 6 months ago, but had never found the quiet time to actually open. She sat down on the soft sofa, curling her legs up underneath her. She opened the book to the very first page, running her hand over the crisp paper. She was not rushing to the dry cleaners. She was not rushing to the crowded grocery store to buy massive bags of baking flour. She was simply sitting in her own home, breathing her own air. The profound, deep silence of the house felt like a thick, warm blanket, wrapping her safely in a brand new, beautifully unwritten chapter of her life. The natural rhythm of the week rolled forward completely uninterrupted by Emily's usual frantic rushing. By Wednesday morning, the sun was shining brightly over the city. Robert stood in his grand, heavily decorated master bedroom. He reached blindly into his massive walk-in closet, fully expecting to find his freshly pressed navy blue suits wrapped neatly in thin plastic. His large hand grasped absolutely nothing. He pulled the sliding wooden doors completely open, his heavy brow furrowing in deep, angry confusion. The expensive wooden hangers were entirely, completely empty. He checked his heavy gold watch, noting the fast approaching hour of his highly important golf luncheon. He marched heavily downstairs, pulling his cell phone quickly from his tailored pocket. Emily was outside in her sunny garden, peacefully watering her blooming pink roses, when the phone began to ring loudly from her apron pocket. She wiped her damp hands carefully on her faded jeans, pulling the device out to answer. "Where are my clean suits?" Robert demanded instantly, his deep voice booming with absolute righteous outrage. "I have the big country club luncheon in exactly 1 hour. Emily, and my closet is completely empty." Emily held the phone loosely against her ear, watching a small yellow butterfly land gently on a soft rose petal. "I am not exactly sure, Dad," Emily replied, her voice remaining perfectly, incredibly calm. "Did you drop them off at the downtown cleaner on Monday morning?" "Of course I dropped them off," Robert snapped loudly, heavily exhaling into the receiver. "You are the one who always picks them up on Tuesday afternoon. You know my strict weekly schedule. Why did you not go get them for me?" Emily took a slow, deep breath of the fresh morning air. "You did not ask me to pick them up, Dad," she stated clearly, firmly, holding her brand new boundary. "I completely assumed you were handling your own personal errands this week." There was a sharp, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Robert was completely, utterly speechless. He was a wealthy, highly powerful man, entirely accustomed to having his daily life seamlessly managed by the women around him. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Robert sputtered loudly, his sudden anger quickly masking his deep, profound confusion. "I am going to look like a total, absolute fool in front of my important business partners." "I am very sorry you do not have your suit," Emily said gently, absolutely refusing to accept his heavy, projected guilt. "You should probably call a rapid delivery service to fetch them from the shop." She ended the call smoothly, placing the quiet phone down on the wooden patio table. She did not run frantically to her car. She did not feel a sudden crushing panic. She simply picked up her green watering can, turning her peaceful attention completely back to her thirsty roses. 2 days later, the crisp Friday morning finally arrived. The local community centre was heavily crowded with wealthy, perfectly groomed neighbourhood mothers. Jessica stood rigidly behind her folding table, feeling a hot, agonizing flush of deep, public humiliation creep rapidly up her neck. Her charity display table looked incredibly, absolutely pathetic. Instead of the massive, beautifully wrapped towers of Emily's famous chocolate brownies, Jessica had exactly 4 crushed, cheap plastic boxes of store-bought cookies. She had panicked late Thursday night, rushing frantically to the local gas station to buy whatever processed junk they had left on the shelves. The neighbourhood board president, a tall woman wearing an expensive silk blouse, walked slowly past Jessica's sad booth. She looked down at the crumbling, pathetic cookies, offering a small, highly condescending smile of pure pity. "It is so very nice that you tried to participate this year. Jessica, the president said, sweetly, her tone dripping with absolutely obvious heavy judgment. Jessica felt hot tears of pure, furious embarrassment prick the sharp corners of her eyes. She grabbed her phone angrily from her designer purse, her manicured fingers flying aggressively across the glass screen. She dialed Emily's number, practically shaking with raw, unadulterated rage. "You completely ruined my social reputation," Jessica hissed venomously the very second Emily answered the call. "The board president literally laughed at my table, Emily. I am the absolute laughingstock of the entire charity event. You did this to me on purpose." Emily was sitting comfortably at her kitchen island, peacefully folding a large load of warm laundry. She listened carefully to the loud background noise of the busy community centre, echoing clearly through the phone. "I did not do anything to you, Jessica," Emily replied softly, carefully folding a soft white towel. "You were entirely in charge of your own volunteer commitment. I simply declined to do the heavy, exhausting baking for you. You are my sister," Jessica cried loudly, totally abandoning any real sense, but "You are supposed to help me look good. You know I cannot do this kind of difficult thing by myself." Emily paused, resting her hands softly on the warm, neatly folded towels. "You are 36 years old, Jessica?" Emily said, her voice carrying a quiet, profound sadness. "You are perfectly capable of driving to a real bakery and buying nice pastries for an event. You just completely expected me to magically save you exactly like I always do. I cannot save you from your own responsibilities anymore." Jessica let out a loud, dramatic noise of pure frustration, violently hanging up the phone without another word. Emily stood alone in her quiet kitchen, looking deeply at the dark screen. The old Emily would have felt a crushing, agonizing wave of heavy, suffocating guilt. The old Emily would have rushed out to a premium bakery, bought a dozen expensive cakes, and raced wildly to the community centre to rescue her sister's fragile ego. But the brand new Emily just let out a long, very slow breath. She was finally consciously allowing the highly dysfunctional system to break down. The heavy machinery of their family relied entirely on her absolute silent compliance. Without her constant invisible effort, they were rapidly facing the natural, deeply uncomfortable consequences of their own helpless behaviour. Emily turned away from the phone, picking up her laundry basket, feeling a strange, beautiful sense of quiet peace settling deeply into her tired bones. The drive up the winding mountain road took exactly 2 hours. Emily gripped the leather steering wheel of her car, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sense of deep excitement. She was driving completely alone without her husband, without her kids, and definitely without her demanding father. The thick green trees parted slowly, revealing the small, weathered wooden cabin, sitting quietly right on the edge of the sparkling blue lake. It was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. She parked her car on the crunching gravel driveway, turning off the heavy engine. The sudden, profound silence was almost completely deafening. There were no ringing cell phones, no urgent demands, and no loud complaints about dry cleaning or burnt carrots. Emily stepped out of the car, taking a very deep, long breath of the crisp, fresh pine air. She walked up the wooden steps, pulling a heavy, rusted brass key from her jacket pocket. The old lock clicked open smoothly, pushing the heavy oak door wide open. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of old wood sweet dust and dried lavender. It was a single large open room with a beautiful stone fireplace sitting right in the centre. The furniture was covered in large white cotton sheets placed there, carefully to protect it from the gathering dust. Emily slowly pulled the sheets off the soft couch and the small dining table, She opened all the glass windows, letting the fresh, cool lake breeze blow directly through the stale, quiet room. She felt an overwhelming, massive sense of complete ownership. This quiet, small space belonged entirely, exclusively to her. It was her very own sanctuary, far away from the heavy, suffocating expectations of her family. Emily found an old, sturdy broom in the small kitchen closet. She began to sweep the wooden floorboards, moving with a steady, rhythmic pace. The simple, repetitive physical labour felt incredibly grounding, completely clearing her anxious, racing mind. She wiped down the dusty kitchen counters, filling a small plastic bucket with warm, soapy water. As she scrubbed the old wooden cabinets, she felt a deep connection to her late mother. Her mother had stood in this exact same spot, seeking the exact same quiet refuge from Robert and his endless, impossible demands. Emily moved toward the small wooden dresser sitting quietly in the corner of the main room. She pulled the top drawer open, intending to wipe away the collected dust. Tucked far back into the deep, dark corner of the wooden drawer, Emily saw a neat stack of small leather-bound notebooks. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She recognized the dark, worn leather instantly. She reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the heavy stack of books into the bright sunlight streaming through the window. There were exactly 5 thick notebooks, neatly tied together with a faded, soft pink ribbon. Emily sat down slowly on the edge of the dusty bed, gently untying the old ribbon. She opened the very first notebook, her eyes scanning the faded blue ink. It was her mother's personal, highly private journal, dated exactly 20 years ago. Emily read the pages slowly, the heavy words hitting her heart like a physical, solid weight. The entries were not about happy family vacations or joyful holiday dinners. They were detailed, agonizing accounts of profound, silent suffering. Her mother wrote about the exact moment Robert forgot their 15th anniversary and how she completely swallowed her painful tears to avoid ruining his weekend. She wrote about spending 4 exhaustive days preparing for Jessica's 10th birthday party, only to be loudly criticized for baking the wrong flavor of expensive cake. Page after page, book after book, Emily read the identical, exact same pattern of emotional neglect. Her mother had constantly, desperately poured from an entirely empty cup, trying to keep a deeply broken family perfectly intact. One specific entry, written just 3 years before her mother passed away, stopped Emily completely cold. "I'm so incredibly tired," the faded ink read the handwriting, slightly shaky and uneven. "I have spent my entire adult life making sure Robert never feels a single ounce of discomfort. I have entirely insulated him from the real world, and he has completely forgotten how to see me as a real, living human being. I am just a useful appliance to him. I pray every single night that my beautiful Emily does not inherit my profound cowardice. I pray she learns to say no before it completely destroys her spirit." Emily closed the heavy leather notebook, pressing it tightly against her chest. Large, hot tears rolled down her face, falling quietly onto her hands. They were not tears of heavy guilt or deep anxiety. They were tears of profound, absolute validation. Her mother had seen the terrible, heavy burden and had desperately wanted Emily to finally drop it. Emily looked out the open window, watching the small waves ripple softly across the blue lake. She was not being petty, she was not being selfish, and she was certainly not ruining the family. She was finally breaking a massive, toxic, generational cycle of silent, deadly sacrifice. She wiped her wet face, feeling stronger, more resolute and more awake than she had ever felt in her entire 42 years of life. Emily pulled her car into her own quiet driveway late Sunday afternoon. The quiet, peaceful weekend at the cabin had completely transformed her. She felt deeply grounded, entirely awake, and wonderfully light. She reached across the front seat, picking up her heavy cell phone. She had left it completely powered down for 2 entire days. It was a terrifying yet absolutely brilliant experiment in setting firm personal boundaries. She pressed the small power button, watching the bright screen slowly illuminate the dark interior of her car. The phone immediately began to vibrate. It vibrated continuously, buzzing loudly against her palm for almost 2 full minutes. The missed notifications flooded the glowing lock screen. There were exactly 47 missed text messages, entirely concentrated in the main family group chat. The group chat was dramatically titled Family First. Emily took a deep, slow breath, steadying her fast heart rate. She unlocked the screen, tapping the green message icon to read the damage. The digital vitriol was absolutely, completely staggering. Jessica had started the massive text thread on early Saturday morning. "Emily is completely ignoring me," Jessica wrote, her digital words dripping with obvious heavy venom. "She deliberately sabotaged my charity event, and now she will not even answer my phone calls. She's throwing a massive childish temper tantrum over that stupid, useless cabin." Robert had quickly, eagerly joined the digital firing squad. "I am profoundly disappointed in your sister, Robert," typed his heavy messages, reading like formal, angry corporate memos. "I had to attend my most important country club luncheon, wearing a heavily wrinkled, completely inappropriate suit. I looked like an absolute total fool in front of my executive board. Emily has completely dropped the ball. She is acting incredibly selfish and entirely disrespectful to our good family name." Jessica fed eagerly on their father's rising anger. "She is just incredibly bitter, Dad," Jessica replied back in the chat. "She sits at home all day while Thomas and I work so very hard to build a real life. She is punishing us because she has absolutely nothing going on for herself. We need to force her to sign those cabin papers immediately before she completely loses her mind." Emily sat in the quiet parked car, reading every single angry, entitled word. The old Emily, the terrified, people-pleasing version of herself, would have instantly typed out a massive, grovelling apology. She would have falsely claimed her phone was broken. She would have desperately promised to make it up to them by cooking an even bigger, more elaborate Sunday dinner. She would have rushed over there begging for their incredibly conditional forgiveness. But the brand new Emily just stared at the glowing screen, feeling a strange, cold, clinical detachment. She remembered the heavy, dark leather journals sitting safely in her trunk. Her mother had quietly absorbed this exact same toxic blame for 35 long years. They were completely, fundamentally incapable of looking at their own personal behaviour. Robert angrily blamed Emily for his wrinkled suit, entirely ignoring the obvious fact that he was a fully capable grown man who could easily drive to the local dry cleaner. Jessica loudly blamed Emily for her social humiliation, completely ignoring the fact that she had volunteered for a major baking event she was far too lazy to actually execute. They were desperately, aggressively trying to shame her back into her invisible, highly subservient box. Emily scrolled slowly to the very bottom of the long, angry thread. The most recent text message was from her father, sent just 3 hours ago. "You need to call me the exact second you read this," Emily Robert demanded. "You owe this family a massive, sincere apology, and you need to resume your normal responsibilities by tomorrow morning. We are absolutely done tolerating this ridiculous, highly selfish behaviour." Emily rested her hand softly on the leather steering wheel. She did not feel the familiar crushing weight of heavy guilt. She felt a profound, crystal-clear sense of absolute untouchable freedom. They were completely showing their true, ugly colours, and she was finally truly seeing them for exactly who they were. She slowly tapped the glass screen, typing a single very short reply into the toxic group chat. "I am safely back from a wonderful quiet weekend at my cabin," Emily wrote, checking her spelling very carefully. "I will not be managing anyone's dry cleaning or baking any charity desserts ever again. I love you both, but I am entirely done carrying your heavy bags. Have a very peaceful Sunday evening." She hit the send button, watching the small blue text bubble appear quickly on the screen. She did not wait to see the typing indicators flash. She did not wait for the inevitable explosive backlash to begin. She simply locked her phone, picked up her purse, and walked confidently out of the car. She walked up to her own front door, unlocking it with a steady, unshakable hand, leaving the heavy, suffocating drama entirely outside in the driveway. Emily pushed the front door open, stepping into the quiet hallway of her own home. She set her purse down on the small wooden entry table, taking a deep, calming breath. The house was entirely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen. She walked slowly down the short corridor, expecting to find a peaceful, relaxing Sunday evening waiting for her. Instead, she found her husband Michael pacing anxiously back and forth across the soft living room rug. Michael was a generally quiet, highly conflict-avoidant man. For 15 long years of marriage, he had managed to comfortably float completely above the toxic, heavy drama of Emily's family. He rarely attended the long, exhausting Sunday dinners, always citing a heavy workload or a convenient sudden headache. He had always happily allowed Emily to act as the permanent emotional meat shield between his quiet life and her highly demanding relatives. He stopped pacing the exact second she walked into the room, running a stressed hand through his thinning brown hair. His cell phone was clutched tightly in his right hand, the screen glowing brightly in the dim evening light. "Your father just called me twice?" Michael said, his voice tight with an unfamiliar, sharp anxiety. "He sounded absolutely furious, Emily. He said you sent a terrible, highly disrespectful message in the family group chat, and then you just turned your phone off completely. He expects me to somehow fix this massive mess you just created." Emily stood perfectly still, looking at the man she loved with a brand new, highly critical perspective. "I did send a message," Emily replied smoothly, keeping her tone incredibly calm and perfectly level. "I simply told them I will no longer be managing their personal adult errands. I told them I need to finally step back and breathe." Michael let out a long, highly frustrated sigh, throwing his arms up in the air in a rare display of open, entirely unhelpful annoyance. "But why did you have to do it exactly like that, Emily?" he demanded, his voice rising in a whiny, complaining pitch. "You know exactly how Robert gets when his strict routine is disrupted. You know Jessica is going to loudly complain about this specific slight for the next 6 months. You are stirring the pot, and now they are actively dragging me directly into the absolute middle of it." Emily felt a sudden freezing cold wave wash over her entire body. She looked at Michael, truly seeing the stark reality of his character for the very first time in a decade and a half. He was not genuinely worried about her emotional well-being. He was not asking how her quiet, solitary weekend at the cabin had been. He was not checking to see if she was finally recovering from her profound, decades-long burnout. He was simply entirely upset that the loud, irritating noise from her family was finally reaching his quiet, completely insulated shores. "You are terribly upset because they called your personal phone," Emily stated quietly, her eyes locking directly onto his defensive, closed posture. "I just do not understand why you cannot just keep the peace," Michael argued, completely missing the massive, heavy point of her entire profound realization. "It is just a few loads of dry cleaning, Emily. It is just a simple batch of charity brownies once a year. Is it really worth blowing up the entire family dynamic? It makes everything so incredibly tense for all of us. I just want a quiet, normal weekend in my own house without your father screaming into my voicemail." The profound, devastating reality crashed down on Emily like a ton of heavy bricks. Michael loved the peace, but he entirely loved the peace that she exclusively manufactured for him. He loved the comfortable, frictionless life that was built entirely on top of her endless silent sacrifices. He never had to deal with Robert because Emily always rapidly absorbed Robert's toxic anger. He never had to navigate Jessica's severe narcissism because Emily always baked the brownies and smoothed over the massive, ugly cracks. Michael was not a neutral, innocent bystander in this highly dysfunctional system. He was an active, highly comfortable beneficiary of her total, absolute exhaustion. Keeping the peace means I have to constantly go to war with myself, Michael, Emily said, her voice dropping to a low, incredibly sharp whisper. It means I have to stand in a boiling hot kitchen for 5 hours every single Sunday while you sit happily on this comfortable couch watching television. It means I have to give up the only single thing my mother ever left me, just so my greedy sister can have a larger, prettier kitchen. That is not real peace. That is just my complete, absolute surrender. Michael blinked rapidly, taking a small, highly defensive step backward. You are being incredibly dramatic right now, he muttered softly, looking down at his dark phone instead of meeting her perfectly steady gaze. I'm just saying you could have handled it much better. You did not have to completely ruin the entire weekend for everyone else in this family. Emily felt the last tiny remaining shred of her old people-pleasing guilt evaporate completely into thin air. Her own marriage was fundamentally built on the exact same highly toxic foundation of her absolute emotional labor. She turned her back on her husband, walking calmly toward the quiet kitchen. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell or cry or desperately beg for his absent understanding. She simply realized with a terrifying absolute clarity that her silent protest could not just stop at her father and her sister. The massive, deeply unfair burden had to be dropped entirely everywhere, starting right now in her very own home. The loud digital alarm clock buzzed sharply on the nightstand at exactly 6:00 in the morning. For 15 years, that specific annoying sound was Emily's daily cue to leap frantically out of the warm bed. She would usually rush downstairs hurriedly, packing 2 healthy school lunches, signing complex permission slips, and mentally coordinating the intricate afternoon carpool schedule. She was the invisible, highly efficient air traffic controller of their entire busy household. Today, Emily reached out a calm hand and pressed the small button to permanently silence the loud noise. She did not throw off the heavy blankets. She simply turned over, resting her head comfortably back against her soft pillow, and closed her eyes for another beautiful 30 minutes. At exactly 6:45, Michael finally stirred. He sat up slowly, rubbing his tired eyes, looking over at Emily in absolute profound confusion. Are you feeling sick today, Emily? He asked, his voice thick with deep morning sleep. You are usually downstairs making the hot coffee and packing the kids' backpacks by now. I am not sick, Michael, Emily replied softly, opening her eyes to look directly at him. I am simply taking a much-needed permanent step back. You are completely in charge of the entire morning routine today, and you are entirely responsible for figuring out the family dinner plan tonight. Michael let out a short, highly dismissive laugh, swinging his long legs over the edge of the large bed. Very funny, Emily, he muttered, completely failing to grasp the severe, absolute reality of her calm statement. I have a massive corporate meeting at 9:00 this morning. I do not have the extra time to play these silly, dramatic little games with you. It is not a fun game, Michael Emily said, sitting up slowly and wrapping a warm fleece robe tightly around her shoulders. I am no longer carrying the entire mental load of this family completely by myself. Leo needs a signed permission slip for his science trip, and Anna needs her clean soccer uniform for the big afternoon practice. The plastic lunchboxes are completely empty on the kitchen counter. Good luck with the morning rush. Emily stood up, walked calmly into the master bathroom, and softly closed the heavy wooden door completely behind her. She turned on the warm shower, letting the loud, rushing sound of the water drown out the heavy, stunned silence echoing in the large bedroom. Downstairs, the highly predictable morning chaos began to rapidly unfold without its usual invisible manager. Emily walked into the bright kitchen at exactly 7:30, fully dressed, incredibly relaxed, and feeling wonderfully rested. She found Michael standing rigidly in the absolute middle of the room, looking completely, utterly terrified. 2 empty plastic lunchboxes sat wide open on the granite island. A half-empty box of sugary cereal was spilled carelessly across the clean tile floor. "Mom, where are my shin guards?" Anna yelled loudly from the front hallway, her young voice echoing with rising familiar panic. "My new soccer coach will literally bench me if I do not have them today." Emily poured herself a fresh cup of hot coffee, breathing in the rich, dark aroma with a small smile. "Ask your father." "Anna?" Emily called back smoothly, taking a very slow, highly enjoyable sip. "He is completely in charge of finding all the sports equipment today." Michael spun around quickly to face Emily, his eyes wide with a sudden crushing anxiety. "Emily, please," he begged, lowering his voice into a frantic, desperate whisper. "Where do you usually keep the shin guards? I cannot find the specific wheat bread Leo likes for his sandwiches, and I have absolutely no idea where you put the science permission slip. You have to help me right now. We are going to be incredibly late for the morning bell." Emily leaned comfortably against the cool kitchen counter. She watched her husband, a highly successful, fully capable adult man, completely crumble under the exact same domestic pressure she successfully managed every single morning for over a decade. He was a senior project manager at a massive firm easily organizing millions of corporate dollars, yet he was entirely paralyzed by the simple task of making a turkey sandwich for his own son. "The shin guards are usually in the laundry room," Michael Emily instructed gently, absolutely refusing to move from her comfortable spot. "The specific wheat bread is in the corner pantry. You can easily print a brand new permission slip from the school website portal. You are a very smart, highly capable man. I am completely confident you will easily figure it all out. But I do not have the extra time," Michael pleaded, his face turning a deep, blotchy red. "I have to leave for my very important office meeting in exactly 10 minutes. "I completely understand your frustration, Michael," Emily replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady and entirely devoid of her usual deep maternal guilt. "I have a very busy morning planned for myself, too. You will just have to adapt exactly like I have adapted for the last 15 years of our marriage." Leo, their 12-year-old son, walked slowly into the kitchen, wearing only one dark sock. He looked at his father, deeply confused by the sudden, highly unusual change in the daily command structure. "Dad, what are we taking for lunch today?" Leo asked, rubbing his tired eyes. "And did you remember to sign my weekly reading log last night?" Michael looked down at his son, completely overwhelmed by the rapid-fire demands. "I do not know about the reading log, Leo," Michael snapped, his voice tight with rising, unmanaged stress. "Just put some stale crackers in a plastic bag and find a green apple. I am trying to find your sister's missing soccer gear." Emily picked up her warm coffee mug and walked calmly out of the chaotic kitchen. She headed directly toward her quiet home office, leaving Michael standing entirely alone in the massive, overwhelming mess. The entire household system was rapidly crashing down around him, completely exposing the massive, invisible foundation of her endless emotional labour. He was finally truly feeling the heavy, suffocating weight that Emily had carried entirely alone. The first 3 days of the brand new dynamic felt like a massive, violent earthquake hitting their quiet suburban home. By Thursday evening, the physical state of the house completely reflected the deep internal chaos of Michael's failing management. A massive pile of dirty laundry sat heavily on the living room floor, completely ignored for over 72 hours. The kitchen sink was overflowing with greasy takeout containers because Michael had entirely given up on cooking real meals by Tuesday afternoon. He had confidently ordered expensive pizza twice in a single week, completely blowing through their usual careful grocery budget. Emily sat peacefully in her comfortable reading chair, sipping a warm cup of herbal tea. She watched her husband frantically dig through a massive pile of clean, unfolded clothes sitting on the dining table. He was desperately searching for his specific dark grey dress socks. He looked completely exhausted, his shoulders slumped heavily under the sudden massive weight of the invisible domestic workload. "I simply cannot find a single matched pair of socks." Michael groaned loudly, his voice tight with deep mounting frustration. He threw a single black sock back onto the messy table. "I have a massive presentation tomorrow morning, and I cannot go into the corporate office looking like a total, absolute mess." "I completely understand your stress, Michael," Emily replied softly, turning the crisp page of her thick book. "The clean laundry was washed on Monday afternoon. You just need to sit down, take a deep breath, and actually fold the clothes. It usually takes exactly 20 minutes if you stay completely focused on the task." Michael let out a loud, highly dramatic sigh, running a heavy hand across his tired face. "I work 10 solid hours a day, Emily," he argued, his tone turning sharp and deeply defensive. "I provide the primary income for this entire family. I should not have to spend my rare valuable evening folding tiny soccer shirts and matching silly socks. You are home by 4 o'clock every single day." Emily closed her book slowly, resting it gently on her lap. She looked directly at the man she loved, feeling a cold, sharp distance growing rapidly between them. "I also work a highly demanding full-time job, Michael," Emily stated clearly, her voice remaining perfectly incredibly calm. "I manage the entire dental office downtown 40 hours a week. My financial contribution pays our mortgage and it completely funds the kids' college savings accounts. My free time is exactly as valuable and exactly as rare as yours." Michael looked away, his jaw clenching tightly with stubborn, unyielding pride. He did not apologize, and he certainly did not ask for her gentle guidance. He simply grabbed a mismatched pair of dark socks, turned his back on her, and stomped heavily up the wooden stairs. The deep emotional distance between them felt like a massive freezing ocean. He was actively choosing to resent her for enforcing a healthy boundary rather than stepping up to be an actual equal partner in their marriage. The heavy, freezing silence extended far beyond the walls of her own house. The family group chat remained completely, entirely dead. Robert had not called her a single time since Sunday afternoon. Jessica had aggressively blocked Emily from seeing her daily social media updates, a highly petty, childish move designed to inflict maximum emotional pain. They were completely stubbornly unified in their absolute refusal to understand her exhaustion. They firmly believed that if they simply froze her out long enough, the terrible heavy guilt would eventually drag her right back into her old, highly subservient role. Friday evening arrived, bringing a thick, heavy tension to the dinner table. Michael had burned a simple pan of chicken breasts, serving the dry, charred meat with a heavy, deeply resentful sigh. Leo and Anna picked quietly at their terrible food, sensing the massive unspoken conflict radiating between their parents. "The annual memorial gathering for your mother is next weekend," Michael announced, suddenly breaking the long, agonizing silence. He pointed his silver fork aggressively across the table. "Robert sent me a very formal, highly terse email today. He wants to know if you are still planning to host the massive catered lunch here at our house, exactly like you do every single year. Emily carefully set her water glass down on the wooden table. A heavy, familiar knot of grief tightened in her chest at the mention of her late mother. She looked around her messy, chaotic home, and then she looked at her deeply resentful husband. "Please reply to my father's email tonight, Michael," Emily said, her voice soft but entirely unbreakable. "Tell him I will definitely be attending the memorial service to honor my mother. But you must also tell him very clearly that I am absolutely not hosting the large gathering at my house this year." Michael dropped his fork loudly onto his ceramic plate. "You are actively trying to destroy this family, Emily," he accused bitterly, shaking his head in profound, stubborn disbelief. "You are completely ruining a sacred, highly emotional tradition just to prove a selfish point about laundry and dry cleaning." Emily did not yell and she did not cry. She simply stood up from the messy table, picking up her own dirty plate. "I am trying to save my own life, Michael," Emily whispered quietly, walking slowly toward the kitchen sink. "And I am very sorry that my survival is so incredibly inconvenient for all of you." She stood at the overflowing kitchen sink, washing her single ceramic plate under the warm running water. The house behind her was completely quiet, save for the tense, heavy breathing of her frustrated husband. She knew the upcoming memorial gathering was going to be the absolute final breaking point. Her father and her sister would never ever accept a completely firm boundary regarding her late mother. They would view her quiet refusal as a massive, unforgivable act of total treason. Emily placed her clean plate carefully on the drying rack. She felt a deep, profound sadness settling into her bones, but she absolutely refused to pick up the heavy bag again. The massive storm was coming rapidly, and for the very first time in her life, she was fully prepared to let it wash completely over her. The following Saturday morning arrived, carrying a thick, heavy blanket of dark grey clouds. It was exactly the 3rd anniversary of her mother passing away. Emily stood quietly in front of her tall bedroom mirror, smoothing down the soft fabric of her simple black dress. She felt a deep, familiar ache in her tired chest. For the last 2 years, this specific morning was a highly orchestrated, incredibly stressful marathon. She would usually be awake by 4:00 in the morning, roasting massive cuts of expensive meat, heavily polishing her father's vintage silver, and frantically cleaning every single corner of her own house to prepare for 30 demanding guests. Today, her own house was completely, wonderfully quiet. Michael was downstairs in the bright kitchen, awkwardly attempting to feed the children a simple breakfast of cold cereal. He was still radiating a heavy, silent resentment, but he had managed to get himself dressed in a dark suit without openly complaining. Emily picked up her small leather purse, taking a very slow, deep breath. She was absolutely dreading the upcoming afternoon, but she also felt a strong, unbreakable core of deep resolve. She was attending the family memorial strictly as a grieving daughter, not as an unpaid, invisible event planner. The short drive to her father's massive, sprawling estate was filled with a dense, highly uncomfortable silence. Michael gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his jaw locked in a rigid, angry line. The children sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the glass windows, entirely sensing the massive, heavy storm brewing rapidly between the adults. When Michael finally parked the car in the long circular driveway, Emily looked out at her childhood home. The grand manicured lawns looked perfectly normal, but the massive, heavy front door was propped wide open, revealing a highly chaotic, entirely disorganized scene inside the large foyer. Emily walked slowly up the stone steps, followed closely by her tense family. The very second she stepped into the grand entryway, the thick, heavy smell of severely burnt pastry hit her nose like a physical wall. The large house, usually kept in absolutely pristine condition, was a massive, incredibly loud disaster zone. A dozen distant relatives were already standing awkwardly in the formal living room, holding empty glass cups, looking completely lost and entirely hungry. There was absolutely no soft background music playing, and the large dining table was completely bare, lacking even a simple clean tablecloth. Jessica burst suddenly from the swinging kitchen doors, her face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She was wearing a highly expensive, completely impractical silk dress, but it was heavily stained with dark, greasy spots of brown gravy. Her perfectly styled hair was a massive, frizzy mess. She was carrying a heavy stack of mismatched ceramic plates, looking completely, utterly panicked. "Where is the extra silverware?" Jessica screamed loudly over her shoulder, completely ignoring the quiet guests, standing in the formal living room. She nearly dropped the heavy plates onto the hardwood floor, her hands shaking violently with unmanaged stress. "Dad, you explicitly told me you hired a professional catering team for the hot appetizers." Robert marched aggressively out of his private study, his heavy face a dark, terrifying shade of furious purple. He was wearing a highly expensive, perfectly tailored black suit, but his silk tie was completely crooked. "I did call the catering company," Robert roared back, his deep voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. "They required a massive, non-refundable deposit exactly 3 days ago. I completely forgot to call them back with my credit card number, Jessica. This is an absolute total disaster. My important colleagues are going to arrive in exactly 20 minutes. Emily stood quietly near the heavy front door, watching the spectacular, highly predictable collapse of their manufactured reality. For decades, she was the completely invisible glue holding this massive, fragile illusion perfectly together. Without her constant, exhaustive management, Robert and Jessica were entirely, completely incapable of executing a simple, dignified family gathering. They had spent the entire week aggressively blaming Emily for destroying the family peace, yet they had absolutely no idea how to actually create that peace themselves. Jessica suddenly spotted Emily standing quietly in the foyer. The sheer, absolute panic on Jessica's flushed face instantly morphed into a vicious, deeply ugly anger. She practically threw the heavy stack of ceramic plates onto a small side table, marching aggressively across the hardwood floor directly toward her older sister. "You are incredibly late," Jessica hissed, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "The entire kitchen is a massive, completely unmitigated disaster, Emily. The large roast is completely frozen solid in the deep sink, and I accidentally burned every single tray of the expensive cheese pastries. You need to get into the kitchen right now and fix this massive mess before the rest of the important family arrives." Emily looked calmly at her sister. She did not take off her dark coat. She did not rush frantically toward the swinging kitchen doors to save the day. "I am not working today, Jessica," Emily replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady, echoing clearly in the quiet, tense foyer. "I am simply a guest at my own mother's memorial. I'm going to sit quietly in the living room and I'm going to peacefully remember her." Robert stopped completely dead in his tracks. He turned his massive, imposing frame very slowly. His dark, furious eyes locked directly onto his oldest daughter. The heavy, oppressive silence in the large foyer deepened incredibly fast. The dozen distant relatives standing awkwardly in the formal living room completely stopped their quiet murmuring. They turned their heads slowly, watching the spectacular, deeply uncomfortable disaster actively unfolding right in front of them. "How dare you stand there and do nothing?" Robert bellowed loudly. His deep, booming voice practically shook the heavy crystal chandelier hanging directly above their heads. "You are standing in your very own childhood home. Emily, you are watching your own flesh and blood actively drown in a massive crisis, and you are completely refusing to help us. "I am not the hired catering staff, Dad," Emily replied gently. She did not raise her voice, and she did not break her steady, calm eye contact. "I am your grieving daughter. I am here to honor Mom exactly like you are supposed to be doing today." Robert took 2 large, highly aggressive steps toward her. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at her face. "This is a highly important, incredibly sacred memorial," Robert yelled, his face turning an even darker, more terrifying shade of red. "This entire day is specifically about honoring your late mother, Emily. She always hosted beautiful, completely flawless gatherings for this family. By refusing to lift a single finger today, you are completely, actively disrespecting her memory. You are making an absolute, total mockery of her entire dedicated life." Emily felt a sharp, sudden pain pierce her chest. Her father was actively, deliberately weaponizing her deep grief. He was using her profound love for her mother as a heavy, blunt tool to violently force her back into submission. But Emily stood her ground, remembering the hidden tear-stained letter, safely locked away in her private drawer. Mom did not love hosting these massive, stressful events. Emily stated clearly, her voice echoing in the quiet, tense hallway. She simply did it because you completely, entirely expected her to do it, Dad. Jessica suddenly let out a loud, highly dramatic gasp. She burst into loud, hysterical tears, dropping her face directly into her stained, greasy hands. She sobbed violently in the absolute middle of the grand entryway, completely abandoning any remaining shred of social dignity. "You are doing this to us on purpose," Jessica wailed loudly. Her high, shrill voice cracked under the immense, crushing pressure of her own total incompetence. "You are entirely ruining this memorial on purpose, Emily. You are so incredibly deeply bitter about that stupid lakeside cabin." Emily looked at her sister, watching the manufactured, highly toxic tears stream rapidly down Jessica's flushed face. The burnt smell of the ruined cheese pastries wafted heavily from the disastrous kitchen, mixing terribly with the expensive, heavy perfume Jessica was wearing. "You have been completely, totally awful to us all week," Jessica cried out, wiping her wet face with the back of her trembling wrist. "You ignored my highly important charity event, and you purposely ruined Dad's expensive suits. You are just throwing a massive, highly toxic temper tantrum over a rotting wooden cabin. You want to see me fail in front of the entire family today. You want Dad to look incredibly bad in front of his important corporate colleagues. You are actively trying to permanently destroy the dynamic of this entire family just because Dad logically asked you to share your inheritance." The heavy, highly cruel accusations hung thickly in the stale air. The silent, watching guests shifted incredibly uncomfortably in their expensive shoes, desperately wishing they were anywhere else in the entire world. Emily looked slowly over her right shoulder. She looked directly at her husband, Michael. He was standing nervously near the heavy wooden front door, staring rigidly down at his shiny leather shoes. He did not step forward to defend his wife. He did not politely ask his angry father-in-law to simply lower his voice. He did not comfort Emily in any way. He just stood there in complete, absolute, terrified silence, completely desperate to remain entirely invisible in the massive crossfire. Emily was entirely, completely surrounded by highly demanding, profoundly selfish adults. They were completely failing at their own basic responsibilities, and they were viciously attacking her for simply refusing to clean up their massive mess. The deep, heavy exhaustion she had carried for 42 years reached an absolute critical breaking point. The quiet, polite silence she had maintained for the last 2 weeks was no longer going to protect her. She needed to finally, completely shatter the heavy glass walls of their toxic, deeply ingrained delusion. Emily took a very deep, long breath, filling her lungs with the stale, tense air. She did not run away, and she did not retreat back to her quiet car. She took off her dark winter coat, folding it very slowly and draped it carefully over the wooden banister. She walked calmly past her furious father, and she walked directly past her loudly sobbing sister. She stepped gracefully into the formal living room, looking at the silent, extremely awkward guests. "Please take a seat at the empty dining table, everyone," Emily announced, clearly her voice cutting sharply through the loud, chaotic sobbing. "The food might be completely terrible today, but we are still going to sit down together and we are going to have a very honest, highly overdue family conversation." The dozen distant relatives moved very slowly, completely terrified by the heavy, thick tension rapidly filling the grand foyer. They shuffled awkwardly toward the massive, bare dining table, pulling out the heavy wooden chairs with incredibly shaking hands. The loud scraping sounds of the thick wooden legs dragging across the polished hardwood floor echoed sharply in the quiet, tense house. Emily walked calmly to the very centre of the long, elegant table. She pulled out a single high-backed wooden chair. She deliberately did not take the absolute head of the table, leaving that specific, highly dominant seat entirely empty for her father. She sat down smoothly, smoothing the dark fabric of her simple black dress. She folded her hands neatly, resting them quietly on the cool, polished wood, completely centering herself for the massive incoming storm. Robert marched heavily into the formal dining room, his expensive leather shoes stomping aggressively on the smooth floor. He stood directly behind the empty head chair, towering massively over the entire room. He gripped the thick wooden back of the tall chair with both of his massive hands, his tight knuckles turning completely, entirely white with unmanaged rage. Jessica followed closely behind him, loudly sniffling into a crumpled, dirty paper tissue. Her highly expensive silk dress was still heavily ruined, completely smeared with the dark, greasy gravy from her earlier kitchen disaster. Michael slunk quietly into the formal room, taking a very distant, completely isolated seat near the far back corner. He was entirely desperate to avoid any direct, meaningful eye contact with his furious father-in-law, completely abandoning his wife to face the heavy firing squad alone. What exactly is the profound meaning of this ridiculous, highly inappropriate spectacle? Robert demanded loudly, his deep, booming voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated anger. "You do not dare give orders in my own house, Emily. You do not completely hijack your own mother's sacred memorial service just to stage a massive, dramatic, incredibly selfish intervention. You will stand up right now. You will walk directly into that messy kitchen, and you will immediately fix the massive catering disaster you completely caused by your sudden, lazy absence." Emily looked slowly up at her tall father. Her dark eyes were completely clear, entirely devoid of the familiar, heavy, suffocating panic she used to constantly feel in his angry presence. She did not raise her voice to match his loud, completely aggressive volume. She kept her tone incredibly soft, deliberately forcing the entire massive dining room to lean forward in their heavy wooden chairs just to hear her speak. "I am not hijacking anything today, Dad," Emily said quietly. Her voice was shaking just a tiny, microscopic fraction, betraying her deep internal fear, but her spoken words remained absolutely, incredibly crystal clear. "I am finally truly participating in this family as a real, living, breathing human being, instead of functioning purely as your silent, completely invisible household appliance." Jessica let out a loud, highly dramatic scoff, aggressively rolling her wet red eyes toward the high, vaulted ceiling. "Oh, please, Emily," Jessica complained bitterly, her voice dripping with incredibly heavy, completely toxic sarcasm. "Spare us the profound, highly dramatic, completely fake victim routine. You are simply throwing a massive, entirely childish temper tantrum. You are just incredibly mad about the lakeside cabin. and you are entirely determined to make every single person in this family actively suffer for your own petty, ridiculous greed." Emily turned her head very slowly, looking directly at her younger sister. The burning smell of the completely ruined cheese pastries drifted heavily into the dining room, a perfect, bitter, physical reminder of the absolute chaos surrounding them. The small wooden cabin was simply the absolute final straw, Jessica Emily replied gently, a deep, profound, heavy sadness washing completely over her tired face. It was the very last tiny remaining piece of my own individual identity that you completely casually expected me to simply hand over to you. But this specific moment right now is not actually about the wooden cabin at all. It is about the absolute crushing silence I have been forced to maintain for my entire adult life. Robert slammed his heavy, flat palm violently down onto the thick dining table. The loud, sharp, cracking smack made several distant relatives physically jump upward in their wooden chairs. "You have absolutely no right to speak to us with such profound disrespect," Robert roared, his heavy face twisting with sheer, unmanaged, completely blind outrage. "You are sitting at a table paid for entirely by my hard work. You are breathing the air inside a house I entirely built. You will show the proper, absolute gratitude you owe this family, Emily, or you will pack your things and leave this memorial immediately." Emily did not flinch at the loud, violent sound of his heavy hand striking the table. She did not quickly avert her eyes, and she did not immediately start crying to beg for his heavily conditional forgiveness. She sat perfectly still, holding her quiet, completely unshakable boundary in the absolute middle of the raging storm. The massive, deeply entrenched power dynamic of their toxic family was actively, violently colliding with her brand new, entirely unbreakable resolve. "I am not leaving this house until I am completely, entirely finished speaking," Emily stated firmly, her shaking voice suddenly finding a deep, powerful, completely absolute anchor. "For 42 years I have quietly swallowed my own voice to perfectly maintain your highly fragile comfort. Today, for the very first time in my entire life, you are both going to sit down, you are going to be completely quiet, and you are going to actually listen to the absolute terrifying truth." The heavy silence stretched across the long dining room. Robert stood completely frozen behind the tall wooden chair. He was entirely unaccustomed to being directly defied in his own home. He slowly lowered his large, heavy hand, sinking slowly into the empty seat at the absolute head of the table. He did not say another angry word, completely shocked by her suddenly unbreakable posture. Jessica sniffled loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her stained silk dress. But she also remained completely quiet. "I have spent my entire adult life making sure you never feel a single moment of discomfort," Emily said, her voice carrying a deep, profound sorrow across the silent room. "Every single Sunday I stand in a boiling hot kitchen for 5 exhausting hours. I buy all the expensive groceries with my own money. I cook every single heavy dish completely from scratch, just so you can sit in the cool air conditioning and read the Sunday paper, Dad. I do not do it because I love cooking massive meals. I do it because you demand absolute perfection, and I was completely terrified of your heavy, crushing disappointment." Robert shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his large wooden chair. He opened his mouth to argue, but Emily immediately held up a single, highly steady hand, stopping him completely dead in his tracks. "I am not finished speaking," Emily stated softly, her dark eyes locking directly onto his flushed face. "You completely expect me to manage your daily, adult life, Dad. You expect me to remember your dry cleaning, your important medical appointments, and your complex social calendar. You treat me exactly like a heavily paid personal assistant, but you do not even offer me the basic, simple respect of a polite thank you. You just expect my constant invisible labour to magically happen while you take all the absolute total credit for a smoothly running family. Emily turned her head very slowly, looking directly at her younger sister. Jessica refused to make any direct eye contact, staring stubbornly down at the polished bare wood of the dining table. "And you, Jessica." Emily continued, her voice filled with a highly agonizing, heartbreaking honesty. "You constantly use my deep emotional exhaustion to completely fund your own comfortable, beautiful life. You sign up for massive charity events fully, knowing you will never ever bake a single simple thing. You just assume I will stay up until 2:00 in the morning desperately baking dozens of heavy chocolate brownies just so you can look incredibly successful in front of your wealthy, important friends. You expect me to magically fix your ruined pastries today while you stand there screaming at me in your expensive stained dress." A single hot tear rolled slowly down Emily's pale cheek, but she did not quickly wipe it away. She let it fall freely, finally, exposing her raw, deep vulnerability to the completely silent room. "I am the completely invisible glue holding this highly broken family together," Emily whispered, the profound truth vibrating heavily in the stale air. "I smooth over every single massive crack. I absorb all the terrible heavy anxiety. I completely manage the complex schedules of everyone in this entire room, including my own husband." She briefly glanced toward the dark corner, where Michael sat in total, absolute silence. "My own marriage relies entirely on my endless, unpaid emotional labour. I constantly shrink my own life, my own needs and my own quiet dreams just to make sure all of you have absolutely everything you want." She paused, taking a deep, slow breath to steady her rapidly beating heart. The dozen distant relatives sat completely motionless, entirely captivated by the raw, highly agonizing confession. "I am incredibly, deeply exhausted," Emily confessed, her voice shaking with the profound weight of 42 years of complete self-denial. "I have spent the last decade crying quietly in my car before I drive home. I have experienced massive, terrifying panic attacks in the middle of crowded grocery stores, completely overwhelmed by the crushing pressure to keep everyone perfectly happy. My heavy back constantly aches, and my tired mind never ever stops running. I am completely, entirely empty." She looked directly at her father, and then directly at her sister, her dark eyes shining with absolute undeniable clarity. "I did not stop running your errands out of petty malice," Emily explained, her voice ringing with absolute pure sincerity. "I am not maliciously trying to ruin this sacred memorial, and I am not trying to permanently destroy the peace of this family. I simply stopped because I am fighting for my absolute literal survival. If I continue to carry your heavy, massive emotional bags, I am going to completely, permanently disappear. There will be absolutely nothing left of me. I am not striking back at you today out of a bitter, childish anger. I am simply refusing to set myself completely on fire just to keep you comfortably warm." The profound, devastating reality of her spoken words hung thickly over the long dining table. It was the exact, undeniable truth they had completely ignored for decades. Emily looked down at her own quiet, still hands. She had finally articulated the immense, agonizing exhaustion she had carried for so very long. She felt a massive, heavy weight lift completely off her tired shoulders, replaced by a deep, beautiful sense of absolute, untouchable freedom. She was no longer their invisible machine. She was finally, truly herself. The large dining room remained completely, utterly silent. Emily reached her hand slowly into her small leather purse. The soft click of the brass clasp echoed loudly in the tense, still air. She pulled out a small dark object. It was a heavy, worn leather notebook. A faded, soft pink ribbon was tied carefully around the cracked spine. Robert stared directly at the dark leather, his heavy eyes narrowing in sudden, sharp recognition. He shifted uncomfortably in his large wooden chair, a deep, highly unsettling feeling washing completely over his flushed face. He knew exactly what that book was because he had seen it resting quietly on the nightstand of his late wife for over 3 entire decades. He always assumed it was just a simple book of daily household lists and basic grocery inventories. Emily placed the old journal gently onto the polished dining table. She rested her trembling fingertips softly against the cracked leather cover. "I went up to the lakeside cabin last weekend," Emily said softly, her voice remaining perfectly steady and incredibly calm. "I went there completely alone to finally clean out the dusty closets. I found a massive stack of these private notebooks hidden far away in a dark, forgotten drawer. Mum wrote in these journals every single day for 35 long years." Jessica let out a small, highly nervous breath. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes completely glued to the old leather book. "What exactly did she write about?" Jessica asked quietly, her previous heavy venom entirely replaced by a sudden, incredibly fragile curiosity. She wrote about her profound, deeply agonizing loneliness. Emily answered gently, looking directly into the tear-filled eyes of her sister. She wrote about the immense crushing weight of making sure this entire family never ever experienced a single moment of real discomfort. Emily slowly untied the faded pink ribbon. She opened the heavy cover, turning the brittle yellowed pages with extreme gentle care. The faint sweet smell of old paper and dried lavender drifted softly across the long wooden table. She stopped, turning the pages near the very end of the thick book. She looked down at the elegant sloping handwriting of her mother. The dark blue ink was slightly smudged in several places, leaving behind the undeniable permanent marks of quiet, silent tears. "I am going to read a single short entry to you," Emily announced quietly, looking up at her silent father. She wrote this exactly 3 years before she passed away. It was written on the very night of your 35th wedding anniversary, Dad. Robert swallowed hard, a large lump bobbing nervously in his thick throat. He gripped the heavy armrests of his wooden chair, completely bracing himself for the massive incoming blow. He did not try to argue, and he did not try to forcefully stop her from speaking. The absolute terrifying truth was finally stepping directly out of the deep shadows. Emily looked back down at the faded page. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to read aloud in the quiet, completely spellbound room. "Today is our anniversary." Emily read her voice, carrying the exact, agonizing weight of the profound sorrow of her mother. "Robert bought me a beautiful, highly expensive gold necklace. He handed it to me while I was standing in the hot kitchen, scrubbing the heavy grease off his favourite roasting pan. He did not look deeply into my eyes, and he did not say thank you for the massive dinner I just cooked. He simply told me to wear the new necklace to his important corporate dinner next week so his executive partners would see how incredibly well he provides for his family. I smiled, and I thanked him, while my entire heart slowly broke into tiny, invisible pieces. Emily paused for a brief, heavy second, letting the devastating words sink deeply into the silent room. She looked up at Robert. His face had drained completely of all its angry colour, turning a highly sickly pale shade of white. She looked back down at the open book, continuing to read the painful, absolute truth. "I realise now that I have made a terrible, entirely catastrophic mistake with my life," Emily continued, reading, her voice breaking slightly on the heavy words. "By constantly catering to Robert, I completely allowed him to take my entire existence for granted. I became a highly functional, silent piece of beautiful furniture in his grand, perfect house. But my absolute deepest regret is, what I have actively done to my own 2 daughters. I have entirely failed to teach them how to actually care for themselves. I completely spoiled Jessica, shielding her from every single natural consequence, turning her into a deeply terrified, highly helpless woman who completely demands rescue. Jessica let out a sharp, highly agonizing sob, covering her face entirely with her stained, shaking hands. The raw, unfiltered truth from her late mother cut deeply through her thick, manufactured arrogance. And worse, Emily read her own voice dropping to a heartbreaking, incredibly fragile whisper. I taught my beautiful Emily to completely absorb all the heavy pain of the people around her. I modelled a life of total, absolute silence. I taught Emily how to slowly, quietly disappear exactly like I did. Emily finished reading the heavy passage. She slowly closed the worn leather cover, retying the faded pink ribbon with shaking, gentle hands. She placed the quiet book back into the absolute centre of the polished dining table. The profound, heartbreaking reality of the deeply guarded secret of her mother hung heavily in the stale, tense air. The invisible, highly toxic foundation of their entire family dynamic was completely, permanently laid bare for every single person to actually see. She knew exactly what she was leaving behind for me, Emily whispered quietly, looking back up at her completely stunned family. She left me that small wooden cabin because she desperately wanted me to have a single safe place to finally breathe. She wanted me to firmly drop the heavy bag she carried for her entire life. She wanted me to finally truly live, and I am not going to fail her again. The heavy truth hung perfectly still in the stale air of the grand dining room. It felt like a massive physical weight had suddenly dropped from the high vaulted ceiling. It pressed firmly down onto the tense shoulders of every single person present. The fierce burning resentment that had heavily fueled the entire morning simply evaporated into nothing. It drained completely out of the large room, leaving behind a devastating, entirely undeniable vulnerability. Robert did not yell. He did not slam his heavy fist against the polished wood again. The proud, tyrannical patriarch of the family suddenly looked incredibly, profoundly old. His broad shoulders slumped deeply forward. He completely lost his rigid, intimidating posture. He stared blankly at the small, cracked leather notebook sitting quietly in the centre of the table. His broad chest rose and fell, with very slow, heavy, ragged breaths. For the very first time in his entire life, the highly successful corporate executive had absolutely no words to speak. He was completely, utterly confronted by his own profound negligence. He saw with absolute terrifying clarity exactly what his comfortable life had actually cost the woman he claimed to love. He had actively reduced his vibrant, beautiful wife to a silent, highly functional appliance. And he suddenly realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had been actively doing the exact same terrible thing to his oldest daughter for 42 years. Jessica slowly lowered her stained, trembling hands from her flushed face. Her loud, dramatic sobbing had completely ceased. It was entirely replaced by a quiet, highly agonizing silence. The thick, smeared makeup around her dark eyes made her look incredibly young and completely, utterly lost. She looked over at Emily, and then she looked slowly down at the ruined, greasy silk of her expensive dress. The deep, stinging truth of her mother's written words echoed loudly in her shocked mind. Her mother had completely spoiled her, constantly shielding her from every single natural consequence. Jessica suddenly realized that her entire carefully curated life was a massive, highly fragile illusion. She was not a successful, independent woman. She was a deeply terrified, completely helpless adult, constantly demanding a rescue that Emily was no longer willing to provide. The crushing, heavy shame washed completely over her, stealing the very breath directly from her tight lungs. In the far dark corner of the formal room, Michael remained entirely motionless. He leaned his heavy head back against the painted wall, closing his eyes in deep, painful realization. He had firmly believed he was the easygoing, highly supportive husband. He had always quietly congratulated himself for staying completely out of the toxic family drama. But listening to the heartbreaking words of his late mother-in-law, he finally saw his own massive complicity. By actively demanding a quiet, frictionless house, he had forced Emily to quietly absorb all the heavy emotional shockwaves completely alone. He had loved the comfortable peace, completely ignoring the massive, invisible war his wife fought every single day to maintain it. He felt a deep, profound sickness in his heart, finally understanding the true, agonizing cost of his deliberate blindness. The dozen distant relatives sat in absolute reverent silence. They did not whisper among themselves, and they did not awkwardly shuffle their expensive shoes. They simply bowed their heads, offering a quiet, profound respect for the painful, beautiful truth that had just been completely fearlessly laid bare. Emily sat perfectly still at the centre of the long table. She did not feel the sudden, crushing panic she had entirely expected to feel after speaking her mind. She did not feel the heavy, familiar urge to immediately apologise or to quickly rush over and comfort her crying sister. She simply felt incredibly, wonderfully light. The massive toxic chain that had tightly bound her to their relentless demands was finally completely broken. She had honoured her mother in the most profound, deeply honest way possible. She had finally spoken the heavy, agonising truth out loud. She slowly pushed her wooden chair back. The soft scraping sound broke the long, heavy silence of the dining room. She stood up gracefully, smoothing the dark fabric of her dress. She reached out gently, picking up the worn leather notebook from the polished table, holding it safely and securely against her chest. "I am going to go home now," Emily said quietly, looking directly at her deeply humbled father. "I am going to spend the rest of this afternoon remembering Mom in my very own quiet way." Robert did not command her to stay. He did not angrily point his thick finger toward the messy kitchen. He simply looked up at her, his dark eyes shining heavily with thick, unshed tears. He gave a very small, almost imperceptible nod of his grey head. It was not a grand spoken apology, but it was an absolute complete surrender. Emily turned around, walking calmly across the smooth hardwood floor. She walked gracefully past her silent sister, and she walked past her completely stunned husband. She reached the grand foyer, picked up her dark winter coat from the wooden banister, and walked quietly out the heavy front door. She stepped into the cool grey afternoon, taking a very deep, beautiful breath of the fresh, clean air. The massive, exhausting war was finally truly over. The cool evening air wrapped around Emily like a soft, familiar blanket. She sat quietly on the dark wooden porch of her own home. The sun had completely set over the quiet suburban neighbourhood, leaving behind a deep, peaceful twilight. A warm cup of chamomile tea rested gently between her cold hands. She watched the small yellow porch light flicker softly against the dark green leaves of the nearby oak tree. The profound, heavy exhaustion of the afternoon had slowly drained away entirely, replaced by a strange, beautiful stillness. She had finally spoken the absolute truth, and the entire world had not collapsed. The heavy front door clicked open behind her. Emily did not turn around, already recognizing the soft, familiar footsteps stepping onto the wooden floorboards. Michael walked slowly out into the cool night air. He was no longer wearing his stiff, formal suit from the disastrous memorial service. He wore a soft, faded grey sweater and comfortable jeans. He did not look angry, and he certainly did not look defensive. He looked incredibly tired and deeply, profoundly humbled. He walked over to the edge of the porch, leaning heavily against the painted wooden railing. He looked out at the quiet, dark street for a long, heavy moment before turning his head to look at his wife. Emily took a very slow, calm sip of her warm tea, waiting patiently for him to speak. "I am so incredibly sorry, Emily," Michael whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. Emily looked up at him, studying the deep, tired lines around his dark eyes. "What exactly are you sorry for, Michael?" she asked gently, absolutely needing to hear him articulate the actual, painful truth. Michael took a deep, shaky breath of the cool night air. He sat down slowly on the wooden steps, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. "I am sorry that I let you carry the entire massive weight of our marriage completely by yourself, Michael," confessed, his voice dropping to a low, agonizing whisper. "I sat in that formal dining room today and I listened to the heartbreaking words of your late mother. I heard exactly how your father completely erased her simply by expecting her to constantly absorb his heavy life. And I suddenly realized with a terrible, sickening feeling that I have been actively doing the exact same thing to you." Emily placed her warm teacup down on the small patio table. She felt a sudden hot prick of fresh tears behind her eyes, but this time they were tears of profound relief. He was finally truly listening. "I loved the quiet, peaceful house we built," Michael continued, looking down at his own shaking hands. "I completely prided myself on staying far away from the toxic drama of your father and your sister. I told myself I was being a good supportive husband by just staying out of the way. But I was not staying out of the way, Emily. I was actively hiding directly behind you. I forced you to act as my permanent emotional shield. I let you go to war with your father every single week just so I could have a relaxing Sunday afternoon." The profound, devastating honesty of his spoken words hung quietly in the cool evening air. Emily reached out, resting her hand softly on his broad shoulder. "I did not want to go to war, Michael," Emily said, her voice filled with a deep, heavy sorrow. "I just desperately wanted my own husband to stand right beside me and help me hold the heavy line. When you complained about the unmatched socks and the missing soccer gear, you made me feel completely, utterly invisible. You made me feel like my only actual value in this entire house was my constant, unpaid labor." Michael turned his head, looking directly into her dark eyes. "I was incredibly arrogant and completely blind," he admitted freely, a single tear rolling slowly down his own cheek. "I got so entirely used to the smooth, perfect magic you created every single day that I completely forgot you were a real exhausted human being, actively bleeding to make it happen. You are not my personal assistant, Emily. You are my brilliant, beautiful wife, and I have been a terrible, incredibly selfish partner to you." Emily felt the last rigid walls of her deep resentment slowly begin to crumble. She saw the genuine, absolute remorse shining clearly in his tired eyes. He was not just apologizing for a single bad week of messy laundry and burned dinners. He was profoundly apologizing for 15 long years of comfortable complacency. "We cannot ever go back to the way things were," Emily stated firmly, her voice carrying a soft, unbreakable resolve. "The silent, invisible engine is completely, permanently broken. I am absolutely done managing every single emotion and every single schedule in this entire family. I never ever want you to go back to that dark place," Michael replied, reaching out to gently hold her small, cold hand. "I am going to step up, Emily. I am going to be a real equal father to Leo and Anna. I am going to learn how to actively run this household right beside you. I am completely ready to share the heavy bag no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it gets for me." Emily squeezed his warm hand tightly. The deep, freezing distance that had grown massively between them over the last 2 weeks finally began to thaw. They sat together on the quiet, dark porch for a very long time, simply listening to the soft rustling of the green oak leaves. It was not a magical instant fix for a decade and a half of deeply ingrained habits. But as they sat shoulder to shoulder in the peaceful night, Emily finally felt the heavy, agonizing loneliness begin to slowly, permanently recede. The painful, necessary rebuilding of their true partnership had officially, finally begun. The bright, warm sun filled the quiet kitchen on Monday morning. Emily stood peacefully by the large glass window, watching a small red bird rest gently on the wooden backyard fence. The entire house was completely, beautifully peaceful. Michael had successfully taken the 2 children to school, leaving early to manage the busy morning traffic entirely by himself. He had packed their plastic lunchboxes, and he had signed the complex school permission slips. It was a small, incredibly beautiful victory, a quiet promise of a brand new equal partnership. Emily took a slow, deep breath of the fresh morning air, feeling a profound, untouchable lightness in her chest. At exactly 10 o'clock, a slow, heavy knock echoed softly from the solid wooden front door. Emily walked calmly down the quiet hallway, feeling a sudden tiny spike of familiar anxiety flutter in her stomach. She reached out, turning the brass lock, and pulled the heavy door wide open. She immediately froze in her tracks, completely, entirely surprised by the unexpected visitor. Her father, Robert, stood quietly on her small front porch. He was not wearing his usual perfectly tailored, highly expensive business suit. He was not wearing his polished, heavy leather shoes or his shiny gold watch. He wore a simple, loose grey sweater and dark, comfortable slacks. He looked incredibly, profoundly different. The massive, intimidating patriarch of the family suddenly looked incredibly small and deeply, entirely humbled. His broad shoulders were slumped forward, and the deep, heavy lines around his dark eyes looked far more pronounced than ever before. "Hello," Emily Robert said quietly. His deep voice completely lacked all of its usual booming, terrifying authority. He did not barge directly into her home exactly like he always used to do. He stood respectfully on the welcome mat, keeping his hands stuffed deeply into his pockets, waiting patiently for her absolute permission to enter. "I know I did not call you first, but I was really hoping we could sit down and talk for a few minutes." Emily stepped back slowly, opening the heavy door much wider to let him inside. "Please come in, Dad," she replied gently, gesturing toward the bright hallway. They walked silently into the warm kitchen. Emily pointed softly to a tall wooden stool positioned at the large granite island. "Please sit down," she offered, reaching up to grab a clean ceramic mug from the wooden cabinet. "I just made a fresh, hot pot of dark coffee." Robert sat down heavily, resting his large, aged hands on the cool, smooth granite counter. Emily poured the hot, dark liquid into the mug, sliding it very carefully across the island. She poured a second matching cup completely for herself, and she sat down directly across from him. For a very long, incredibly heavy amount of time, neither of them spoke a single solitary word. The hot steam rose slowly from their ceramic cups, dissolving completely into the quiet, still air of the room. The coffee grew completely, entirely cold, as the profound, heavy silence stretched massively between them. The only sound in the entire house was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the small wall clock hanging above the sink. Robert stared deeply into the dark, cold liquid, completely avoiding her steady, calm gaze. He looked like a man who had entirely lost his compass, wandering blindly through the total, absolute wreckage of his own massive ego. His large hands trembled slightly against the hard stone counter, a rare, shocking display of pure, physical vulnerability. "I did not sleep for a single passing minute last night," Robert finally whispered. His voice cracked with a raw, unfamiliar emotion, sounding incredibly dry and completely exhausted. He looked up, and Emily saw a deep, absolute sorrow shining clearly in his tired, aged eyes. I sat completely alone in my massive, quiet living room, and I thought extensively about your mother. I thought about the dark, worn leather notebook you placed so carefully on the dining table yesterday afternoon. Emily wrapped her warm hands tightly around her own ceramic mug, waiting quietly for him to continue his incredibly difficult confession. I always believed I was a good, highly righteous man. Robert continued, his voice dropping to a low, agonizing whisper. I firmly believed that because I built a massive corporate company and provided a beautiful, wealthy home, I was completely exempt from doing the actual heavy emotional work of a family. I demanded absolute perfect peace at all times. I completely forced your beautiful mother to quietly absorb all the heavy, exhausting damage of my rigid demands. I turned my own wife into a silent, entirely invisible servant, Emily. I completely erased the bright, vibrant woman I married, simply because her actual needs were far too inconvenient for my busy schedule. A single sharp tear escaped his right eye, rolling slowly down the deep creases of his weathered cheek. He did not quickly wipe it away with a silk pocket square. He simply let it fall, fully accepting the immense, crushing weight of his absolute, undeniable guilt. The terrifying, completely untouchable giant of her childhood was finally truly acknowledging the deep, agonizing pain he had caused. Emily sat completely still, listening to the quiet, highly profound sound of his massive, lifelong delusion completely shattering into tiny, irreparable pieces. Robert looked up from his cold, dark coffee. He looked directly at Emily, his heavy, lined face completely stripped of its usual intimidating armor. "I did not just do it to your mother, Emily," Robert said, his voice breaking with a deep, profound and highly agonizing sorrow. "I did the exact same terrible thing to you. For the last 3 years, ever since she passed away, I simply transferred all of my heavy, impossible expectations completely onto your tired shoulders. I completely treated you like an unpaid, highly efficient employee instead of treating you like my own beautiful daughter. I demanded your constant time, your absolute energy, and your perfect Sunday dinners entirely, without a single passing thought for your own private life." Emily felt a massive, heavy knot dissolve completely in her tired chest. Hearing him actually say the specific words, finally acknowledging the exact painful truth, was incredibly, profoundly healing. It felt like a massive physical weight was being lifted directly off her lungs. "You did treat me exactly like a silent machine, Dad," Emily replied gently, keeping her voice incredibly soft but absolutely entirely firm. "You never once asked how my own marriage was actually doing. You never asked about the daily lives of your own grandchildren. You only ever called my personal phone when you needed a massive problem completely fixed, or when you needed a heavy, expensive shirt immediately dry cleaned. I felt completely, utterly invisible to you." Robert nodded slowly, closing his tired red eyes. I know, he whispered, the heavy, crushing guilt completely destroying his usual towering pride. I was incredibly arrogant and entirely, completely blind. I was completely terrified of living alone in that massive, empty, quiet house, Emily. I was absolutely terrified of actually facing my own deep, unresolved grief. So I forcefully filled my entire schedule, and I completely forced you to meticulously manage every single detail of it. I made my own selfish, highly demanding comfort the absolute center of your entire beautiful universe. It was a cruel, deeply unfair, and incredibly selfish burden to place on my own hard-working child. He reached slowly with a trembling hand into the inner breast pocket of his loose grey sweater. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He placed it gently onto the smooth, cool granite counter, sliding it very slowly across the large, wide island until it rested directly in front of Emily. He did not issue a loud, demanding corporate order. He simply pulled his hands back, resting them quietly and completely still in his lap. "What exactly is this?" Emily asked, looking down at the heavy, perfectly sealed paper. She did not reach out to touch it immediately, completely maintaining her safe emotional distance. "It is the original legal deed to the lakeside cabin," Robert explained softly, his dark-aged eyes shining brightly with a fresh hot wave of completely unshed tears. "I officially withdrew the public listing from the real estate broker early this morning, Emily. I called my corporate lawyers and I instructed them to entirely drop all the legal transfer paperwork. I was completely wrong to ever ask you to sell it. It does not belong to me, and it certainly does not belong to your younger sister. It belongs solely, exclusively, and entirely to you. Your mother desperately wanted you to have a safe, quiet, beautiful sanctuary, and I completely promise on my absolute honor that I will never, ever try to take it away from you again." Emily reached out slowly, resting her small, warm hand gently on top of the heavy brown envelope. The rough, thick paper felt incredibly solid and profoundly real beneath her fingertips. It was not just a simple piece of remote wooden real estate sitting quietly on a blue lake. It was the ultimate, undeniable physical proof of her own highly fought, completely victorious independence. It was a beautiful quiet, an absolutely unbreakable promise of true peace. "Thank you, Dad," Emily whispered quietly, feeling a deep, warm and highly profound sense of genuine gratitude completely wash over her tired, healing heart. Robert offered a very small, highly fragile and incredibly unsure smile. It was the very first time in her entire 42 years of life she had ever seen him look so incredibly, genuinely humble and so totally human. "I am going to actively learn how to manage my own adult life," Emily Roberts stated firmly, a tiny quiet spark of his old resolve slowly returning. But this specific time it was directed entirely, completely inward. "I am going to drive my own car to pick up my own dry cleaning, and I am going to learn how to cook my own simple, quiet meals. I do not ever want you to spend another 5 exhaustive, painful hours standing in a boiling hot kitchen just for me. I just want to sit at a simple table with you simply as your father and truly enjoy your beautiful, highly valuable company." Emily smiled back, a genuine soft and entirely unforced curve of her lips. "We can certainly do that, Dad," Emily agreed gently, feeling the deep, freezing, highly painful distance between them finally permanently begin to melt. "We can completely start over and we can build a brand new, highly healthy, completely equal relationship. But it will definitely be very incredibly different. The heavy Sunday dinners will be entirely, completely shared, and they will never ever be mandatory again. I would not ever expect anything less," Robert replied, taking a very slow, deep and incredibly cleansing breath of the quiet kitchen air. He stood up slowly from the tall wooden stool, pushing it gently and quietly back under the thick granite island. He looked carefully around the bright, peaceful, entirely clean house, finally truly recognizing the beautiful, calm, and highly independent life his daughter had built entirely for herself. He did not linger, and he did not awkwardly overstay his welcome. He walked slowly toward the bright front hallway, his heavy footsteps sounding incredibly soft and entirely profoundly respectful. Emily walked him calmly to the heavy front door, opening it wide to the bright, warming morning sun. Robert turned back one last quiet time, looking deeply and entirely affectionately into her dark eyes. "I am so incredibly, profoundly proud of the strong, highly resilient woman you have finally become, Emily," he said softly, his voice full of genuine, absolute awe, before stepping slowly out into the warm, bright day leaving her completely alone in her quiet, beautiful, incredibly hard-earned peace. The warm morning sun slowly shifted across the kitchen floor, turning into a deep golden afternoon light. Emily remained sitting quietly at the large granite island, her small hands resting softly on top of the heavy brown envelope. She felt a profound, deep sense of peace settling into her tired bones. For the very first time in her entire life, the heavy, suffocating anxiety of pleasing her father was completely, entirely gone. Suddenly, the quiet, peaceful silence of the house was broken by the sharp, loud ringing of her cell phone. It vibrated aggressively against the hard stone counter. Emily looked down at the bright screen, seeing her younger sister calling. Her stomach tightened in a very small, familiar knot of dread. Jessica had aggressively blocked her on all social media just 2 days ago. Emily took a very deep, slow breath, steadying her fast heart rate, and she swiped her finger across the smooth glass to answer the active call. "Hello, Jessica," Emily said gently, keeping her voice completely calm and perfectly level. For a long, highly agonizing moment, there was absolutely no response. Emily could only hear the sound of heavy, ragged, completely exhausted breathing coming through the small speaker. It was not the loud, highly dramatic, manipulative sobbing Jessica had used in the grand foyer. It was a very quiet, deeply ugly, entirely genuine sound of pure heartbreak. "I am so incredibly, totally lost, Emily," Jessica finally whispered, her high voice cracking under a massive weight of profound shame. "I am sitting alone in my expensive, completely messy kitchen, and I do not even know how to turn on my own heavy oven." Emily felt a sudden deep pang of genuine sympathy for her younger sister. She did not feel angry, and she did not feel the heavy urge to quickly rush over and save her. She simply listened, allowing the heavy, uncomfortable silence to hold the painful truth. "I have been incredibly, completely awful to you," Jessica sobbed quietly, blowing her nose loudly into a paper tissue. "I blamed you for the ruined bake sale, and I blamed you for the disastrous memorial because I was completely terrified of looking at my own massive failures. You have always been the incredibly smart, entirely capable sister. You always knew exactly how to effortlessly manage everything, Emily. I just felt like a highly useless, completely stupid child standing right next to you." The raw, unfiltered honesty of her confession caught Emily completely by surprise. She realized with a sudden, profound clarity that her constant rescuing had actively stunted her sister. By constantly stepping in to fix every single mistake Emily had accidentally taught Jessica that she was entirely incapable of managing her own adult life. "You are not a stupid child," Jessica, Emily replied softly, her voice filled with a deep, profound, sisterly love. "You are a highly intelligent, completely capable woman, but Mom completely sheltered you from every single natural consequence, and then I simply took over exactly where she left off. We completely robbed you of the very necessary, highly uncomfortable opportunity to actually learn how to fail. I completely relied on your deep exhaustion to fund my own highly fake success," Jessica admitted freely, a fresh wave of hot tears making her voice shake violently. "I demanded you give up the beautiful lakeside cabin because I am so incredibly insecure about my own marriage. I thought a massive, expensive new kitchen would magically fix all my deep, terrifying problems. I was entirely, completely wrong, Emily. I'm so incredibly sorry for treating you like an invisible, highly convenient servant." Emily closed her eyes, letting the sincere, highly agonizing apology wash completely over her tired heart. "I accept your apology, Jessica," Emily said gently, feeling the last heavy chains of their toxic dynamic finally permanently break apart. "I love you very much, but I can never ever be your personal manager again. We cannot ever go back to the old highly broken system. I do not want you to manage me anymore." Jessica sniffled quietly, taking a very slow, highly shaky breath. I actually want to learn how to bake my own simple cookies. I want to learn how to completely organize my own charity events. I just want to sit at a table with you and actually talk to you like a real equal sister, instead of constantly begging you to fix my massive, entirely messy life. We can definitely do that. Emily smiled softly, a single happy tear rolling slowly down her own cheek. It is going to be incredibly messy and highly uncomfortable for a while, Jessica. You are going to burn a lot of heavy pastries, and you are going to forget a lot of important details. But you are going to actively learn, and I am going to be right here, simply cheering for you from the sidelines. Thank you, Emily, Jessica whispered, sounding incredibly tired but deeply, profoundly relieved. I am going to actively start trying today. They stayed on the quiet phone for another 10 minutes, simply talking about small, entirely normal things. There were no heavy demands, no frantic scheduling crises, and absolutely no toxic guilt. When Emily finally ended the peaceful call, she set the phone down next to the heavy brown envelope. The massive, highly destructive storm of the last few weeks had completely passed. The painful, incredibly necessary realignment of her entire family was finally complete. She looked out the bright kitchen window, feeling completely, utterly ready for the beautiful, entirely shared future that was actively waiting for her. Exactly 6 months passed since the heavy, devastating afternoon of the memorial service. The crisp, cool autumn breeze blew gently through the open kitchen window, carrying the sweet scent of falling leaves. It was exactly 5 o'clock on a Sunday evening. The warm, golden sunlight bathed the large granite island in a soft, inviting glow. Emily stood leaning comfortably against the doorframe, holding a delicate glass of red wine. She was not wearing a stained, heavy cooking apron. Her comfortable shoes were securely tucked away in the front closet, and her tired feet did not ache with the familiar crushing pain of forced servitude. She simply stood there, perfectly relaxed, watching the absolute beautiful chaos of a completely shared family dinner. The kitchen was incredibly loud, but it was no longer the highly toxic, frantic noise of deep resentment. Michael stood directly in front of the hot stove, wearing a dark blue apron over his casual weekend clothes. He was loudly humming a cheerful, upbeat tune, expertly stirring a large, heavy pot of boiling pasta. He checked the thick, bubbling tomato sauce, carefully adjusting the heat with a highly confident, relaxed smile. He was completely, entirely in charge of the main course. He did not ask Emily where the wooden spoons were hidden, and he did not panic over a missing ingredient. He had spent the last 6 months actively learning how to navigate his own kitchen, transforming from a highly helpless bystander into a genuinely equal, deeply present partner. The heavy front door swung open, bringing a sudden gust of cool, fresh air into the warm house. Jessica walked loudly into the bright hallway, carrying a large, slightly lopsided cardboard bakery box. Her husband Thomas followed closely behind her, holding 2 cold bottles of sparkling cider. Jessica did not march in demanding immediate, frantic attention. She did not complain about the heavy traffic or her exhausting schedule. She walked straight into the busy kitchen, setting the white box down gently onto the granite island. "I actually baked the dessert entirely by myself today," Jessica announced proudly, opening the cardboard lid to reveal 24 slightly burnt, heavily frosted chocolate cookies. "They are definitely not as perfect as your famous recipes, Emily, but I absolutely managed to follow the instructions all the way to the end." Emily walked over, picking up a warm, imperfect cookie. She took a small, careful bite, smiling genuinely at her younger sister. "They are absolutely delicious, Jessica," Emily said softly, feeling a deep, profound swell of real, highly authentic, sisterly pride. "You did an incredibly wonderful job. Jessica beamed, her face lighting up with a true unforced joy that Emily had not seen since they were very young children. She did not need the cookies to look completely, flawlessly perfect to impress her wealthy friends. She simply wanted to contribute a small, honest effort to the shared family table. In the adjacent formal dining room, the heavy wooden chairs scraped softly against the polished hardwood floor. Robert was not sitting rigidly at the absolute head of the table, impatiently waiting to be served. The proud, formerly tyrannical patriarch was actively walking around the long table holding a tall stack of clean ceramic plates. He was entirely engaged in the simple, highly domestic task of setting the table. Leo and Anna walked right beside their grandfather, carefully placing the silver forks and folded white napkins at every single place setting. "Make sure you put the water glasses on the right side," Leo Robert instructed gently, his deep voice completely stripped of its old, terrifying authority. His tone was incredibly patient, warm, and highly affectionate. He patted his young grandson softly on the shoulder, smiling down at the boy with a deep, genuine love. Emily watched her father carefully fold a white napkin, feeling a massive, heavy wave of pure peace wash entirely over her. The deeply toxic, perfectly manicured illusion of their old life was completely, permanently gone. The heavy, invisible bag she had carried for 42 years was finally, truly unpacked. They were functioning as a real, highly imperfect but beautifully connected family. The heavy burden of the weekly gathering was now equally divided, completely breaking the dark generational cycle of silent sacrifice. Emily took a slow, deep sip of her red wine, stepping fully and completely happily into the warm light of her beautiful, brand-new normal. The dinner progressed with a loud, entirely joyful energy that Emily had never ever experienced in her own home. The heavy, bubbling pasta was served directly from the hot pot, completely lacking the formal, highly rigid presentation her father used to strictly demand. Some of the thick tomato sauce spilled slightly onto the clean white tablecloth, leaving a small, bright red stain near the centre of the table. In the past, that tiny, single stain would have caused a massive, highly stressful panic attack. Emily would have jumped frantically from her wooden chair, desperately scrubbing the expensive linen to avoid her father noticing her failure. Tonight, Robert simply looked down at the spilled red sauce. He reached out with a casual, relaxed hand, grabbing a spare paper napkin. He wiped up the small mess entirely by himself, completely, without a single passing word of bitter complaint. He simply smiled, returning quickly to a lively, highly animated conversation with his young grandson about a recent science project. Emily watched the small, incredibly beautiful moment happen, feeling a deep, profound validation settle warmly into her tired chest. The sky did not fall, and the entire world did not magically end over a tiny, spilled drop of dinner. Of course, the brand-new family dynamic was certainly not completely, flawlessly perfect. Old, highly stubborn habits occasionally tried to creep quietly back into the corners of their daily lives. Just last week, Jessica had called Emily in a sudden familiar panic, completely overwhelmed by a simple paperwork error at her brand-new job. The old, incredibly desperate tone was heavily present in her shaking voice. Jessica had actively hinted very strongly that Emily could easily call the office manager and quickly fix the massive misunderstanding for her. Emily had paused, feeling the heavy, familiar pull of her old, lifelong conditioning. The intense, deep urge to immediately rescue her younger sister was incredibly, profoundly strong. But Emily had simply taken a very slow, deep breath, firmly gripping her warm cell phone. "I completely believe in you, Jessica," Emily had replied softly but incredibly firmly. "You are a highly smart, very capable woman, and I know you can definitely handle this difficult conversation by yourself. Call me back when you finish it and tell me exactly how it went." Jessica had briefly, quietly grumbled, feeling the sudden, highly uncomfortable friction of doing her own adult work. But exactly 3 hours later, Jessica had called back, her high voice completely bursting with a true, genuine pride. She had successfully navigated the complex issue all by herself, completely without the heavy, invisible crutch of her older sister. The small, highly uncomfortable boundary had forced Jessica to actually grow, replacing her deep, toxic anxiety with a brand new, highly authentic confidence. Sitting at the long wooden dining table, Emily finally felt completely, utterly present in her own beautiful life. She was no longer a frantic, highly invisible manager, constantly floating completely above the shared experience to ensure absolute impossible perfection. She was sitting comfortably in her own chair, actively tasting the rich, delicious food her husband had lovingly prepared. She laughed loudly at a terrible, incredibly silly joke told by her young son. She listened deeply and with a true open heart to a long story told by her father. For the very first time in 42 long years, Emily felt deeply, profoundly valued simply for actively existing, rather than being constantly valued for what she could silently provide. She felt incredibly light, as if a massive, invisible lead blanket had been completely, permanently lifted from her tired shoulders. The deep, agonizing exhaustion that used to completely define her entire identity was finally truly gone. She was simply a completely equal, highly beloved guest at her own beautiful family table, and looking around at the loud, happy, completely imperfect faces of the people she loved, she knew she would never ever go back to the quiet, dark silence again. Exactly 2 weeks after the loud, beautiful family dinner, Emily packed a single small overnight bag. She drove completely alone up the winding mountain road, feeling a deep, profound anticipation building warmly in her chest. The tall green trees parted slowly, revealing the small, weathered wooden cabin sitting quietly right on the edge of the sparkling blue lake. She parked her car on the crunching gravel driveway, turning off the heavy engine. The sudden, profound silence of the remote forest was absolutely deafening, but this specific time it did not feel lonely. It felt incredibly, completely full. It felt like a deep, welcoming embrace from an old, highly cherished friend. Emily walked slowly up the wooden steps, pulling the heavy brass key from her jacket pocket. She unlocked the solid oak door, stepping into the cool, quiet room. The small cabin was exactly how she had left it months ago. The furniture was no longer covered in dusty white sheets, and the clean wooden floors shone softly in the bright afternoon sunlight. She walked directly into the small bedroom, setting her bag gently down on the soft quilt-covered bed. She walked over to the old wooden dresser, opening the top drawer with a steady, highly respectful hand. The stack of dark leather notebooks, neatly tied with a faded pink ribbon, rested quietly in the very back corner. She picked up the heavy stack carrying the old journals carefully out of the quiet house. She walked slowly down the narrow wooden path, heading directly toward the old weathered dock, floating softly on the clear blue lake. The wooden planks creaked gently under her feet, a familiar, highly comforting sound from her deep childhood memories. She sat down at the very edge of the wooden dock, letting her bare feet dangle slightly above the cool, rippling water. She untied the faded pink ribbon opening the very first leather notebook and rested it softly on her lap. The bright sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the distant horizon. The clear blue sky slowly transformed into a breathtaking, highly vivid painting of deep orange, soft pink, and brilliant purple hues. The bright colours reflected beautifully across the calm mirror, like surface of the large lake. Emily read the faded ink of her late mother, but she no longer felt a heavy, crushing wave of profound sorrow. She felt a deep, warm connection, entirely free of the toxic, agonizing guilt that used to bind them perfectly together in absolute silence. "You were completely entirely right, Mom," Emily whispered softly into the cool evening breeze. The quiet wind rustled gently through the tall pine trees, sounding almost exactly like a soft, approving sigh. "I finally stopped carrying their heavy bags. I finally stopped running their entire lives for them, and you would be so incredibly proud of exactly what happened." Emily watched a small, solitary bird fly gracefully across the bright painted sky. She thought about her father, carefully setting the dining table with a genuine, humble smile. She thought about her younger sister, standing proudly in the messy kitchen with her slightly burnt cookies. She thought about her own husband, actively partnering with her to build a highly balanced, completely equal life. The entire family was actively healing slowly, growing into highly authentic, perfectly imperfect versions of themselves. By finally dropping the heavy, invisible burden, Emily had not destroyed the family she deeply loved. She had actually saved them from their own profound helplessness. She had forced them to actually look at themselves, and in doing so she had given them the absolute greatest gift of all. She had completely allowed them to finally become capable, responsible, entirely, fully functioning adults. Emily closed the heavy leather notebook, tying the faded pink ribbon back around the worn cover. She looked out at the brilliant fading sunset, taking a very deep, completely cleansing breath of the crisp mountain air. She had finally truly found her own unbreakable voice. And by speaking the absolute truth, she had beautifully, profoundly honoured the silent woman who had carefully left her, the small wooden sanctuary. The heavy generational chain was completely, permanently broken. Emily pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms warmly around her legs. She watched the last sliver of the bright sun dip entirely below the distant horizon, sitting completely alone in the profound, beautiful, quiet feeling, incredibly, deeply, and absolutely free. True family love is not found in silent sacrifices or endless overcompensation, but in shared burdens and mutual respect. Setting boundaries is not an act of defiance, but a profound act of love that forces a family to heal, grow, and finally see each other's true inherent value.